Hey, Brian Gill here with Gillware. Just wanted to talk a little bit about maybe the most complicated stuff we do, which is kind of RAID or SAN or server recovery. These arrays come in many shapes and flavors, notoriously difficult to give accurate pricing, especially from a video, but I just want to kind of walk through the process and some kind of expected pricing, or at least have you understand kind of our under the covers formula on where pricing comes from. So there's a bunch of different types of equipment that are out there, whether it's a simple 4-drive, RAID 5 in a Synology box, or a 32-drive complicated system from an enterprise SAN, and we see everything all the time. There's not a day that's gone by over the last 15 years, especially in the last 10 years, where we don't have at least a handful of these cases in flight around here. So what's going to impact the price? The number one thing that's going to have a dramatic impact on price is the speed that you require. If the situation is one that isn't super time sensitive, maybe you're a consumer and have photos and videos of your family on there, you're going to choose our standard services. They're relatively quick. It's going to get work done under our standard service, and that is going to not have my engineering staff here all nights and weekends, and it's not going to inconvenience a whole bunch of other clients because you're jumping in line. And probably 90% of the cases we see come through as far as these RAIDs go come in under our standard service banner. If you care about pricing more than you care about speed, you're going to want to stick with the standard service. The second big factor is the type of incident. We see kind of two major categories of incident. We see hard crash. The unit was working one day and it's gone. And usually that's something hardware related, whether that be with the RAID card itself, or which it almost never is, or the more common thing, which is multiple hard drives have failed. And it's usually that they didn't fail simultaneously. Almost always we see one drive failed historically. The system was not configured with any kind of automated monitoring like a Nagios, or it either didn't have a physical alarm, or the alarm's been sounding in a data center for months and nobody noticed. And then when the second drive or the third drive failed, that's when everybody saw the array disappear. So that's kind of case number one. And then case number two is everything's healthy, and people call in and say, hey, good news, the array's perfectly healthy. The bad news is a human has done something. Maybe it's a malicious human, or maybe it's a accidental button push of some kind, but a human deleted a logical unit, or they deleted a logical server, or they reinitialized the SAN to some they tried to expand the SAN and it went sideways. They tried to add storage and it was doing a rebuild and failed after 37% or something. So those cases where the storage is healthy but data's been deleted, reinitialized, unallocated, partially overwritten, partially rebuilt, these are the most complicated we see. So when we get this call, we'd rather the equipment was broken, believe it or not. As far as what happened after the accidents, that's kind of the third kind of main factor on how much work this is going to be and what it's going to cost. And sometimes the answer is nothing. The unit hard crashed, we brought it up, looked at it in the RAID console, and it said it was incomplete, or the physical array settings were poofed, or somebody deleted that LUN and went, oh my god, what did I do? And they didn't do anything else. And that would be great. We also see people do all kinds of crazy things. We see them RMA drives. So, 2 drives failed, and we took them and shipped them back to the manufacturer so that we could get replacement drives. Well, that's going to have a pretty dramatic impact on our ability to recover it if you start shipping data stripes off to Singapore for refurbishment. So don't do that. We also see people, again, they don't know what they're doing. Sorry if you're one of them. They throw a bunch of blank drives in and they force rebuilds because they think that this RAID rebuild is going to magically help things. It won't. All a RAID rebuild does is take the current logical state of the union and it tries to make it redundant across multiple drives. If your current state of the union is, I can't access any of my data because all my data went missing, the last thing in the world you'd want to do is rebuild that situation. So again, rebuilding doesn't help you get your data back. It helps take the state of the union and make it redundant, which if your state of the union is bad, rebuilds are bad. And if you did that, it makes it much harder for us because you're going to have probably destroyed some of the parity information that may be required or partially required to get you an optimal recovery. And we see situations where people reinitialize the array, then go to like the data backup unit or the backup hardware, and then write 500 gigs of data to the new state of the union. And it's a 3 terabyte volume, so you didn't overwrite everything, but you did physically permanently stomp 20% of the data blocks. And again, believe it or not, we recover data in those situations all the time, but they are very problematic on the engineering hours required to get to an optimal recovery. And there's usually some data loss associated with such an event. So did nothing is better than did something, and it doesn't do any good to like say, oh, I don't think anything happened. 'Cause when it gets here, the hours that it takes to recover your data are not going to be impacted by the brief phone conversation we have. So it's better just to data dump everything that you know about it. And if you made some mistakes, just tell us what they were. And that's going to allow our staff to adequately or more adequately prep you for an accurate quote based on the facts at hand. Otherwise, we aren't going to be as accurate, and we'll have to come back later and say, well, this is a lot more complicated than you told us. Looks like somebody reinitialized the array last Tuesday and wrote 200 gigs of data to it. And then they'll say, yeah, it's like it doesn't do any good to hide these facts. So just give us everything. And if you're a managed service provider, and you're embarrassed about some of these mistakes, get over it quickly. The more information you can give us, the better we're both going to be able to serve your clients. So kind of the fourth thing that's going to impact the recovery is the amount of layers of complexity between us and your data. And this has a lot to do with stuff on how it's configured in the first place. Sometimes we see it's a NAS unit and it's got 4 drives in it, and there's one physical array that's like a RAID 5, and then there's one straight up NTFS data volume, and you connect it to this thing with just like a eSATA or SATA cable or USB or FireWire cable. That's about the simplest type of setup that we can get, and simple is good. That's about as few layers to the onion that is possible. On the flip side of that, sometimes we see there's a SAN and there's multiple different physical arrays with that SAN, and sometimes it has a NAND cache out in front of it that's holding on to most recently altered or accessed blocks. So that's a complicated physical array with multiple hot spares, some of which have engaged over time or whatever. Then ultimately that SAN is then chopping them with some sort of sometimes proprietary file system or under the covers Linux file system, where it is carving logical units, sometimes nonlinear logical units that are using like lazy initialization, or they're dynamically applying storage to it, which is again more complicated than just a linear volume. Sometimes from there we take that LUN and we've got some creation of like some iSCSI target files, and we're going to present them through like a hypervisor. And that hypervisor is then taking that block storage, putting maybe multiple storage pools on it, and then those pools are getting carved into VMFS volumes, and those VMFS volumes have sometimes 1 to 37 virtual disks, and those virtual disks are sometimes themselves snapshotting and having delta files and all the metadata that tries to piece them together. And then ultimately, once you figure that out, you have like an NTFS volume that has your data on it. So we see both of these situations and everywhere in between, where it's either a simple setup or 7, 8 layers to the onion. And the more layers to the onion, the more human time it takes to carve that, especially when things have gone sideways. And a lot of that original configuration has gone poof or gotten altered, or 20% of it has had new data written to it. And we have to try to figure out what the previous regime looked like. So again, if I've kind of made your brain melt a little bit, I apologize, but this is the type of stuff that we bump into. And then people want to know, how much is this going to cost? Ultimately, it's going to come down to kind of two factors, as we've talked about. Um, but is there any hardware to repair? Well, that's going to cost money. Usually, there's 1 to 3 pieces of equipment that are going to need some flavor of repair. Each one is going to cost some money, and then the real cost comes down to human engineering hours. Um, to give you some perspective, let's just say we got a 3 or 4 drive RAID 5 in, and it had a couple drives go bad, and it was just a straight up physical Windows server running like 2010 or something, or 2013, and it just had an NTFS volume on it. Pretty straightforward stuff from some like Dell PowerEdge or something like that. In those cases where there's not very many layers to the onion, all we're going to do is repair the failed units, compare them along with the healthy units to try to figure out what is the best and most optimal physical configuration. Usually not utilizing the stale drive, the one that failed first. Hopefully we can figure out what that is, or we can always figure out which one that is, but hopefully we don't need it at all, because the other one that failed most recently has healthy platters and hasn't been altered too dramatically. And we might be able to, in less than 10 hours of work, and in less than 1 or 2 drive repair costs, a bill that gets spit out on that case with our standard service might be less than $5,000 or $6,000. The types of people that do this type of work bill out internally here at about $300 an hour. So if we're looking at $3,000 worth of analysis and rebuilding and RAID emulation and quality assurance, and then $1,000 or $2,000 of drive repair costs, you might hear a quote of like $5,000 or $6,000. And if that's what you hear, count yourself pretty lucky. That's about as cheap as anything we do around here when it comes to these RAIDs. On the flip side, on that really complicated, let's just say you're calling from an enterprise environment and you've got, to 12 drive RAID 6, and they're all huge drives with millions and millions of files, and one of your humans reinitialized the array, and now you need us to recover 37 virtual machines. Cases like this could be 100 hours at $300 an hour. You might hear a bill or a quote in that neighborhood of $20,000 to $30,000, and that's what it is. It's just a straight up hourly engagement, and we communicate every day or so, just kind of let you know what the humans are doing and how far they've gotten, and as we recover data we can make it available. But and if you only need data from 2 or 3 or 4 of those volumes, it certainly can drive that cost down, because there can be a somewhat linear relationship with the amount of data that you need and the amount of time it takes our humans to isolate and test and quality assure each volume that's been recovered. It may not dramatically impact the cost as much as you might think, but it will have an impact. And then again, our standard service is a certain timeline. We're going to have a certain projection for you. Does this require our emergency services? And if you're going to call us on Friday and say, hey, I'm going to overnight this stuff in, or hire a courier to fly it in, and you want our best and brightest of our computer scientists untangling your situation all weekend, 24/7 till it's done, this is going to be very expensive, and we're going to take a large retainer. Specifically, what we do is, after we gain an understanding for how much we think the minimum hourly engagement is going to be to get some data, which is usually not going to be where we end up, but we're going to take a retainer for that. So if you describe a situation that is, it sounds like a minimum of 40 hours of work to get us where we need to be, and this is the human hours. This isn't machine time. When the human is sleeping, you're not being billed. But if one of our best humans is going to work on your stuff 18 hours a day over a weekend, you're going to hear a quote, and you're going to need to give us a retainer, over $20,000 probably. I pay those humans when they're here, and we're busy enough, and we have enough of a backlog historically, and we're good enough at what we do and have a good enough reputation where, when you're in that situation, I do have empathy for it. But my organization, I can't afford to have my techs here, my engineers here all weekend working on this stuff, not seeing their families, not hanging out with their kids. When they're here at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night, I'm paying them, and I'm paying them a lot. And I'm not really paying them, you are. And that's just kind of the situation we're in. If you don't like the way that sounds, this is a great opportunity to start thinking about, well, do we really need the priority service? And if when you really think about it, the cost of the downtime for your organization is going to be okay with saving the organization a healthy 5 figures to get the data back more slowly, that's kind of music to both our ears. These emergency or priority services, we have to supply them. Our clients demand that we supply them, but if we could have every single one of our clients happen to be in situations where they could stick with our standard service, it would make it easier on my staff and our families. And what can happen if you burn people out and just have people here every weekend over and over and over again, then they're not going to work here anymore. And that's my burden. And you're in a situation right now maybe where you need the service, and if you do, you're just going to pay a lot of money for it, and the human that I'm trying to retain in the long term is going to reap a lot of that financial benefit directly, and that's how I keep them employed here. Again, we talked about a lot here. Cases like this, I'll leave you with, you have to call. We don't want these complicated situations just showing up at our doorstep. It does happen, and if you just happen to ship us this stuff, we will assess the situation. We will talk to you about it after we get it. These assessments cost us a lot of money and a lot of time. Depending on the situation you send, it's not at all uncommon for our internal feasibility study where we make our forensic clones of the working hardware and assess the broken hardware, and sometimes we even have to temporarily make fixes to the broken hardware in order to try to recover some data, just so that we can get our database of forensic artifacts and file system shrapnel, so that we can start to see and start to get an understanding of, is the data that our client wants on here somehow? Do we see any inodes that represent the files they're talking about? And what do we think the parity, the rotation, the stripe size, what do we think the physical array was? What file systems, because again, sometimes there's 3 of them. Sometimes there's an ext file system and a VMFS file system and a NTFS volume. Like, what are how complicated does this damn thing look? And it might take one of our best people 1 or 2 days just to evaluate it. And the last thing that I want to ever have happen is that we spend that day or that 2 days evaluating this hyper complicated situation, give somebody a quote that we probably could have given them over the phone, and then have them say, nah, it's not worth it to us. We've got a backup from 7 months ago and we're just going to roll with that. That's going to be it's kind of a mean thing to do. So please call first. And we will do our best to give you as accurate of a quote as we possibly can, so that you, your organization, your insurance company, whoever your technical advisors are on your end, can make a solid decision on whether or not it makes any sense to engage us. I'd rather talk to you for 2 or 3 hours on the phone, and if you end up determining, like, geez, we're going to go a different direction or pick a different provider, that's fine. We never have any big problem with that. But we want to always get the opportunity to get as many details as we can about the type of equipment, the type of configuration, and by that I mean, like, we are running VMFS 5.5 or whatever the situation is. The type of data that's recoverable, or that you need recovered. If you have a backup from 7 months ago, we want to know that. In fact, getting access to that temporarily can even help us do the job faster, because we can kind of see all the old inodes and have the expected sizes and maybe understand what the volumes were named and how big they were. So the more information we get, the faster this whole thing goes. And again, the more information we get about the data types that you're after, what's most critical. Sometimes our clients will say, hey, I don't care about the domain controller. The SQL Server database, we have a firm backup on. We're good there. What we're lacking is the file store, and it's just a bunch of straight PDFs and Word documents and easily automatedly testable files. And again, that'll allow us to give you the most accurate quote as possible, and once we actually get to work, we know what the goal is, and that should help us get us there faster as well. Versus sometimes people tell us, we want everything recovered and it all has equal value, which is incredibly unlikely, and we don't believe you. It's usually an IT guy that doesn't want to, do the diligence on their end to actually find out, well, my clients desperately need the accounting share because they're trying to do payroll on Thursday. That's the type of information that we need. So, again, if you're still watching this video a million minutes later, I apologize, but this stuff is really complicated. My staff here at Gillware is amongst the best in the world, if not the best in the world, at taking the most complicated situations and turning it into data. The last thing that I didn't mention is it's not at all uncommon for cases like this on your end. There's going to be a specialty insurance adjuster sometimes. So maybe your organization has business insurance or some sort of a cyber policy that's going to get applied to this type of IT disaster. And if you know that that's happening, tell us, because what they may want is a failure analysis report from us, where we can actually put pen to paper or virtual pen to paper and say, this is what happened, and these are the dates that it happened on, and this is why the crash happened. And they will take that report and they'll look at your insurance coverage, and they will try to determine, is this not covered, partially covered, fully covered, or whatever the situation will end up being. Don't call us 3 months after this engagement, after we've gotten your data back, and say, hey, my insurance adjuster wants a failure analysis report. We are not going to be able to help you. We are going to have destroyed all of our copies of your data at that point, and our engineer will not have kept the level of notes required to make that report, because we're trying to save you money. To put pen to paper and to keep all those notes super carefully so that everything we put in that report is accurate and we can put a reputation behind it, that's going to take us an extra 4 to 8 hours. And what is time? Time is money. So if you don't need it, we're not going to do it. But the one catch is, if you want it and need it, and it's after we've shipped all your equipment back to you, and after we've zero-filled our copies of your stuff, and after we didn't keep all that careful of notes, we're not just going to make some goofy report, and we're just going to say, I'm sorry, we can't help you. And that may have an impact on your insurance coverage. So again, this is Brian Gill. A lot of times, the more complicated the job, the more common it is to have, like me, one of my lead engineers, you, somebody from the business, one of the IT providers, maybe even the insurance company or one of their representatives, all get on a conference call, talk at length about the situation, and then we can describe how we would engage, or you would engage us, and all make a decision if it makes any sense to proceed. So hopefully that was a comprehensive peek behind the curtains of RAID or SAN or complex virtualization data recovery, and we look forward to serving you if you're interested. Thanks.